Hey T-Heads, this is Don from Mayleaf. In this video, I'm going to be discussing life's most fundamental mystery and the questions upon which all other questions throughout the history of humankind rely. It's Chinese New Year here when I'm recording this. And for those of you who don't know, every Chinese New Year, I like to take a sidestep away from our usual content, which is all about talking directly about tea, to discuss thoughts and fascinations which I often ponder upon while I sip my brews. These ideas also inspired the creation of last year's reality carousel game and our delicious source projector tea, which is in my pot and in my cup today. The base questions, the ones which have occupied, inspired, and confused humans since the dawn of our species are: what is reality and how does reality come to be? The attempt to answer these questions creates an avalanche of other mind-spinning inquiries relating to spirituality, epistemology, philosophy, morality, maths, science, art. They are, in essence, the source of so many strands of human activity and thought that by addressing these base questions, we are actually addressing the heart of all human inquiry. So, what exactly is reality and how do we even begin to unravel its mystery? Well, I think that the best place to begin is by looking at how we all experience reality, because while asking the question, what is reality, may seem on the surface to be an objective question, we can only rely on our subjective experience of reality to define it and to question its nature. All of reality is, after all, experience and can never be distinguished from our senses. The colors that we see, sounds that we hear, emotions that we feel, and meanings that we derive from the universe are all a creation of inner experience. A particular shade of red may be encoded within the number of its corresponding electromagnetic wavelength, but the red itself does not actually exist physically. It does not stain and streak the air between the rose and my eye. Instead, it is the creation of a brain which decodes a grey soup of information from our senses to manifest a shade of red in our mind's eye. Who knows if my experience of that red is in any way the same as yours? Who knows if my experience of reality is the same as yours at all? David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher of the 18th century, said, "Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty." Even if we believe in an objective reality which exists independent of our subjective minds, the assessment of that reality, the instruments that we may use to measure it, and the interpretations of the results of those measurements or of any studies are all processes of the subjective mind, informed by our senses. Indeed, the very concept of objectivity and objective science are created, understood, and explored by subjectivity. Objective truth can never be experienced or studied without individual subjective consciousness, and yet, ironically, objectivity relies on the assumption that this subjective consciousness is not necessary for its existence. Objectivity is therefore a paradox and is unfalsifiable, which means that it is impossible to be proven to be false, but is not necessarily true. As such, the study of objective reality at its core kind of falls outside of the scope of the scientific method, which ideally requires falsifiability, and becomes more of a philosophical rather than a scientific conversation. Objectivity itself becomes a bit of an oxymoron, as it can only ever be subjectively objective. Therefore, whether or not you believe in objectivity, there can be no argument in the primacy of subjectivity. So, this is the first way that the subjective observer is inextricably connected with the definition of reality. Everything is subjective, even objectivity, and any human definition of reality requires acknowledgement of the role of the human subject and human consciousness. As physicist Heinz von Foerster said, objectivity is the delusion that observations could be made without an observer. Or, in the words of the great mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, the misconception which has haunted philosophic literature throughout the centuries is the notion of independent existence. There is no such mode of existence. Every entity is to be understood in terms of the way it is interwoven with the rest of the universe. Once we have closed the door to isolated objectivity in the search for the truth of reality, we have to immediately recognize that subjectivity is continuously and inevitably prone to bias. We are all individuals. The way that we experience and interpret reality is shaped by so many different factors, from inheritance, from our genes to our life story to our own unique intrinsic awareness. We are therefore always biased, despite our protestations that we seek objective truth. Show me a man who claims he is objective, and I'll show you a man with illusions, said the American magnate Henry R. Luce, who created Time magazine in the 20th century. Now, there are many, many forms of bias, from clear and conscious bias to discrete and unconscious ones. The most tricky forms of bias are cognitive, such as confirmation bias, where we naturally place more emphasis on information which supports our pre-existing beliefs and reduce emphasis on contrary evidence. Creating the absurd illusion of an objective reality or truth which can be studied and explained by minds which are free from subjective interpretations and bias is, in my opinion, the road to corruption, dogma, and a kind of calcified thinking. The pernicious idea of the plausibility of independent objectivity is, I think, one of the foundational problems to the current crisis in science. It stems in part from the transformation of science in the public domain from a place of rich inquiry and exploration to being presented to the public as an impartial, objective provider of definitive answers to be used by corporations and governments to inform policy. This kind of religionization of objectivity and science as the source of all answers has created a chasm between what science can do and what it pretends to do. Instead, to grapple with the question of reality, we need to take a multidisciplinary approach, bridging science with philosophy, art, and religion to try to devise a better understanding of the nature of reality and how it came to be. Art, you may ask? Well, if subjectivity has primacy over all else, why not derive meaning about reality from the study of art, a practice which embraces subjectivity above all else? Aesthetic cognitivism is a relatively new example of a multidisciplinary approach to understanding reality by incorporating art, philosophy, science, psychology, theology, and more to unravel the big questions. I believe that by embracing the fundamentally subjective experience of reality, we can explore more universal meaning and truth. As Nelson Goodman put it in The Ways of World Making, the arts must be taken no less seriously than the sciences as modes of discovery, creation, and enlargement of knowledge. So, while the majority of mainstream science is predicated on the belief that reality is objective and separate from mind and consciousness, we have shown that this is in fact unprovable. But this is not the only problem facing mainstream objective science. The other, in my opinion, relates to determinism. Most scientists consider themselves to be objective materialists, believing that reality is fundamentally made up of matter and that mental states and consciousness are simply emergent from matter as a result of evolved complexity. For the majority of scientists, matter is the only building block of reality, and the mental or spiritual worlds are figments of an imagination which has emerged simply by matter forming into brains. As such, materialists treat consciousness as a weird little anomaly and not important at all when describing reality. Matter acts, according to the classical laws of physics, in an entirely predictable way, in an evolving dance of cause and effect. Given all of the knowledge of a particular state of matter, we can apply these laws of physics to know exactly what will happen next to that matter, how it will transform and interact to create the next state. If you apply this statement to all matter in the universe, then the universe itself becomes predictable. In other words, materialists believe that given the initial states of the early universe and our knowledge of physical laws, we can theoretically map out the journey of every atom of matter to show how the universe evolved to its present state. And also, since matter is unthinking and undeciding, demonstrate that it would have been impossible for the universe to be any other way. Moving on, these materialists therefore believe that since everything is just matter, the future of the universe is already written and can never be changed. The cause and effect laws of physics will continue to play out, and we can map out the future with absolute certainty. This is called determinism, and most scientists consider that we live in a deterministic universe. In addition, many scientists also subscribe to the block universe theory, which states that the past, present, and future are all already existing in a block of space-time, and that time is just an illusion. This is called eternalism. So for all objective materialists, which make up the majority of scientists out there, I would say, the future is either already written or already exists. And since we and other conscious beings are, according to them, nothing more than just bits of matter, every thought and action that we take is already determined, out of our control, and may have already happened in the block universe. We are just more things floating in a universe of things and subject to the same commands of things with no experience which has not been preordained by cause and effect. In other words, if you subscribe to objective materialism, then you believe that everything is fated and determined, and that the concept of free will is yet another illusion, just like consciousness. Materialists are fatalists and state that we have no control or sway in what happens in our lives. According to objective materialists, I did not choose to have that cup of long jing this morning. Instead, that act of tea drinking with those exactlies brewed in exactly that way was already written at the birth of the universe. In the reality carousel game last year, which many of you have played, I wanted to reference this idea of determinism by declaring that the fates would decide who the prize winners were every week. From all of the picture entries that were submitted for every clue that was released, the prize winners were not chosen on merit or according to my preferences, but instead were picked randomly by the fates. Although, of course, according to the pervading theories of mainstream science, the choice of which pictures were taken and submitted by you and which ones would have won the prizes was entirely predicted long before we were even alive. I wanted to take this idea of determinism to its conclusion at the finale of the game as the fated pictures transformed into stars of a night sky, referencing the idea that our fate and our future is, according to materialists, already written in the stars. The problem with determinism is that it feels so very alien to our experience of reality. We all feel like we have free will, and yet according to the majority of scientists who believe in an objective materialistic reality, we actually do not. They say that every decision which you make and every act in your life from large to minute is out of your control and already decided billions of years before your conception. The words that I'm speaking right now in this setting, through these cameras, with this cup of tea in front of me, everything that is happening, from my posture to the inflections in my voice, to every thought going on in my head, was, according to materialist scientists, already determined long before I even existed. Similarly, the fact that you are watching this video on that screen in your setting, wherever you are, with the clothes that you are wearing and the thoughts that are being generated in your head, these were all written to at the birth of the universe. Does that sound plausible to you? Or is this some incredibly fanciful explanation which is the result of clinging on for dear life to a belief in materialism despite it reaching seemingly absurd conclusions? Determinism is again a concept that, strictly speaking, cannot be explored scientifically because it is once again unfalsifiable. After all, we can never prove that any action was not already fated. It leaves us at a very unsatisfactory dead end and relegates us to a life of passive acceptance in fate. It also opens the doors to many other questions, which we don't have time to dive into today. Questions such as morality. If everything is fated, then we have no human agency or control of our actions. So why do these same scientists presumably teach their children right from wrong? And why should we as a society choose to prevent crime or punish someone who has wronged another? After all, the actions that we take are supposedly all out of our control, right? I suppose, according to determinism, we teach morality and prevent crime simply because matter has fated us to do so and for no other reason. Again, this statement is unfalsifiable, but I think that for everyone listening, it is deeply at odds with our experience of reality and seems just plain wrong. So we've already discussed two reasons why the mainstream view of reality as fundamentally objective and made solely of matter is, in my opinion, difficult to accept. The first is that reality is experienced and is entirely subjective, and therefore we can never separate out the objectivity to prove or disprove it. The second is that materialism requires that everything is determined and that we have no free will, a statement that is so incongruous with our actions as humans and our sense of reality. A third issue is that objective materialism does not yet have any answer to the ultimate question of how this material reality came to be. If everything is predetermined as a result of cause and effect, then everything is contingent or dependent on a previous state. So how did it all begin? What was the non-contingent start which set off this chain of cause and effect? As Terence McKenna famously said, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. We cannot ignore that one free miracle if we are to accept materialism as the true basis of reality. There has to be an explanation of why there is something rather than nothing and how the universe began if you are a materialist. Even the mainstream view of the Big Bang Theory is now being questioned these days, and materialism offers very few answers so far as to how reality came to be. So what are the alternatives to the material reductionist view of reality? Well, over the course of human history, we have heard of many ideas, all of which invoked a reality which transcends the material world. Plato developed his theory of forms, which states that the physical world is a mere imitation of a more timeless, non-physical and absolute reality made up of forms and ideals. He developed the allegory of Plato's cave, where prisoners kept in a cave believe that the shadows that they see cast on the wall are true reality, when in fact they are mere representations of a reality outside or behind them that they cannot see. In this allegory, we are the prisoners, observing the illusory shadows of the physical world and thinking that this is all that makes up reality. This idea of invisible realities, of forms and ideals, is often appealing to mathematicians who cannot conceive that maths is a creation of the human mind and rather than being invented, is a reality that has been discovered. After all, could 1 plus 1 ever have been invented to equal 3? The fact that mathematics so accurately describes the physical world and our universe seems to suggest that it must have been there long before human minds. So if mathematics exists outside of both the mental and the physical world, then does that support this sort of Platonic concept of ideals? And then we dive into the vast and fascinating world of theology, with yet more explanations of reality, usually invoking a creator and invisible spiritual realms manifesting the universe that we experience around us. While it is often lazily considered that theology is unscientific, in fact, there are many physicists who also believe in God for very logical and considered reasons. Thomas Aquinas set out the 5 rationales for the existence of God. Some you may agree with, others you may not. But the logic behind the concept of God is, in my opinion, as impossible to dismiss as some of the logic behind materialism, as we talked about. At least that one free miracle problem encountered by materialists is kind of taken care of by the idea of God, unless, of course, you are interested in asking the follow-up question of how God came to be, who is the creator of the creator. Okay, so clearly I cannot cover the deep and rich world of religion in this talk, but I wanted to acknowledge the role of religion in informing this debate and discussion about reality. Instead, let's try to simplify the common viewpoints regarding the nature of reality. In so doing, we can see that the big battleground, as far as I can see, is the role of the mind and consciousness in the definition of reality. Have a sip of tea before I launch into this. So, on the one hand, we have materialism. This is the idea that we've already discussed and is the most, I would say, common viewpoint in science. Perhaps arguably, but I think that's the case. And this viewpoint is that reality is just made up of matter and the mind is an unplanned byproduct which emerges from the physical complexity of the brain. This is a monist point of view. Singular. Monist means singular and reductionist. Everything is matter, full stop. Then you have a pluralistic or dualistic view of reality. This is the idea that there are many coexisting realms, substances or principles, which all come together to create reality. The classic Western example of pluralism is the dualistic viewpoint famously espoused by Descartes. In his view, mind and matter coexist in different realms, and reality is actually formed of both mind and matter. And finally, you have the idealist view of reality. As with materialism, this is another monist position, as it states that ultimately reality can be reduced to one underlying substance or principle. But instead of matter, this singular substance is non-physical, according to idealists. Most often, idealists see reality as primarily made from mind or consciousness. They say that physical reality is not the creator of consciousness, but the other way around. So the physical universe is not just experienced by consciousness, but is actually made from consciousness and maybe a shared conscious hallucination. I know, pretty wild, right? Idealism has found its way in varying forms into the philosophy of some of the West's great thinkers, from Hume to Berkeley to Kant to Hegel, and in sacred texts of the East, such as Buddhism and some Indian philosophy. Idealism has had various guises throughout history, from the more tame objective idealists who accept that a physical reality exists but is not independent of the mind, to subjective idealists who state that the material world is completely and entirely dependent upon the minds of the subjects who perceive it. The most extreme form of idealism is metaphysical solipsism, which is the philosophical idea that only your own mind can be sure to exist, and that the external world and others, including me, have no independent existence outside of your own consciousness. Treat me well in that head of yours, please. But is this all just the flight of fantastical thinking? Or could these philosophies actually relate to reality? And if so, how? The most accurate scientific theory that we have today is quantum physics. And while, yes, there is a tendency to over-mystify quantum physics, the fact is that quantum is at its core very strange and counterintuitive. Don't worry, this is not going to be a long discussion of quantum mechanics, but let's just quickly deal with the main weirdness of quantum and how it may relate to reality, or at least how it's being discussed with this debate of reality. In quantum, everything is described by a wave function. This wave function is used to calculate the probability of measurement outcomes, such as the position of a particle. The issue is that subatomic particles will act like waves of probability, seemingly in superposition, which means that they have no fixed location, but just show a cloud of probable locations. The attribute of that particle, such as its location, seems to become fixed in space and time only when a measurement is taken. In other words, the particle seems to change behavior when it is measured, as if it knows it is being measured and can no longer exist in a cloud of probability, but must take a fixed position. This is called the collapsing of the wave function, and it has caused fascination and frustration to scientists for nearly a century. The measurement problem, as it has been termed, is the central weirdness of quantum physics in my view. Does matter change behavior when it is measured? And does that measurement require an observer? And if so, then how or why? Now, there are many interpretations of quantum physics which are used to try to explain the measurement problem. The Copenhagen interpretation was first coined by Bohr and Heisenberg, who discovered quantum mechanics, or were the main people who discovered quantum mechanics, and has evolved to become a collection of views which all posit the same basic approach, that quantum mechanics first and foremost is intrinsically indeterministic, and that somehow the act of measuring affects the system and turns probability into actuality. As Bohr said, when we measure something, we are forcing an undetermined, undefined world to assume an experimental value. We are not measuring the world, we are creating it. And his counterpart, Heisenberg, is quoted as saying, "The path comes into existence only when we observe it." These interpretations seem to open the door to views which are alien to materialists. They are saying that the fabric of reality is actually a strange conjunction of particles and waves that are interacting in this sort of cloud of superposition, of chance and probability. And therefore, the universe may not be deterministic. And humans are, in some capacity, therefore, free to shape our own lives. The future is not written, and our choices are not predetermined. Many of these interpretations of quantum mechanics believe also that the act of observational measurement seems to determine the behavior of reality, converting potentiality and probability to actuality. The more extreme proponents of the Copenhagen interpretation go further to invoke the requirement of a subjective observer, which starts to sort of move us into the ideas of idealism, that somehow consciousness is participatory in creating and shaping the physical universe from those clouds of probability. John Wheeler, the famous American theoretical physicist, asked the question, may the universe in some sense be brought into being by the participation of those who participate? And Niels Bohr said, everything we call real is made of things that cannot be regarded as real. While Heisenberg famously wrote that quantum mechanics represents the final failure of determinism, and flirting with idealism said that the ideas are more fundamental than the objects. Of course, some of these ideas may seem very far-fetched. If you are a proponent of idealism, then you have some difficult questions to answer too. especially if you're a proponent of subjective idealism. As Einstein famously asked fellow physicist Abraham Pais one night, "Do you think the moon does not exist when you are not looking at it?" These are the first questions that anyone would ask an idealist. Do things really disappear when they are not being observed? Does idealism require human consciousness? In which case, then, how did the universe exist before human consciousness? Or did it? For some, consciousness is universal and timeless, and human consciousness just taps into it using our brains like an antenna. Perhaps it is this universal consciousness that creates the physical universe. How does this intertwine with religion? Could this universal consciousness be somehow equated to God? It is also important to note that there are many other interpretations of quantum mechanics, but interestingly, they can seem as wild and fanciful as the others. The many worlds interpretation is the materialist way, in my opinion, to explain away the measurement problem and hold onto determinism by claiming that there is never a collapse of the wave function, but instead all quantum possibilities actually happen in a near infinite number of worlds with their own alternative histories and timelines. So the particle is in all of the positions at the same time, but in different worlds. And we just happen to be in the world where that particle was in that particular location when it was measured. So materialists don't only cling on to the idea that the universe is entirely fated, but that there are an uncountable number of quantum worlds or parallel universes which all have their own unique fated timelines. That is pretty wild and may be great for Hollywood movies, but seems like a, in my opinion, desperate attempt to steer away from the sticky subjects of free will and consciousness and quantum in order to hang on to materialism. Other physicists favor superdeterminism, quantum decoherence, and other interpretations of quantum. I don't want to give you the false idea that quantum physics necessarily supports the idealist view of reality, but one thing is for certain: the measurement problem has not been solved, and until we have a unifying theory to explain quantum and its relationship with classical physics, all possibilities must be considered plausible. So where does this leave us? What is reality and how did it come to be? Are the idealists right? Is the physical universe a manifestation of consciousness? Is, as we tried to depict in this tea artwork, consciousness the source projector manifesting the world and the universe around us? Or are the materialists correct in saying that reality is only made of matter and that consciousness emerges by accident from the complexity of the brain with an illusion of free will? Perhaps the pluralists have had it right all along, and reality is made of many physical and non-physical substances and principles, all coexisting independently, yet influencing each other. Or maybe there is a God who has created our reality by design and exists within or outside of it. The fact is that we still don't know the true nature of reality, and we will probably never know it for sure, at least while we are alive. Although we may lean towards one philosophy or one faith over another, reality remains a mystery, and how it came to be an even bigger one. But the beauty of asking this most fundamental of all questions is that it leads us to create the most wondrous ideas and engage in the most fascinating maths and science. It fuels the deepest of conversations and inspires some of the finest art. Pondering the very nature of reality is therapeutic too, in my opinion. It gives us the widest possible perspective to survey our lives and reduce the noise. And while I cannot, of course, give you the answer to the questions of reality, I will remind you of the one certainty that I think we can take from this whole discussion. Reality is a subjective experience. It is your experience and yours alone. It should be celebrated and not quenched or invalidated by those desperate to impose a singular objectivity to your reality. Ask big questions and share ideas while always cherishing your own sacred, individual, subjective experience of reality, and allow others to cherish their own. As the great writer, philosopher, and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Every mind has a new compass, a new direction of its own, differencing its genius and aim from every other mind. We call this speciality the bias of each individual, and none of us will ever accomplish anything excellent or commanding except when he listens to this whisper, which is heard by him alone." I raise a cup of the Source Projector and wish you all a very happy, inspirational, and tranquil Year of the Dragon. Happy New Year. Cheers, everybody. Bye.